Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and today I'd like to run you through this second module in the Orchite Age expansion series to Entromancy, a cyberpunk fantasy RPG. As Struct introduces a new system for building and telling stories within the Entromancy universe, it offers a brand new set of GM tools that can be used a la carte as needed, featuring a full system for GM-less or GM-light Entromancy play. Now, what does a GM-less or GM-light play session look like? Well, I've been thinking a lot about, you can tell that I crunch on a lot of this stuff, and sometimes it's like shower thoughts or like I'm awake at night thinking about role-playing games. But like, what does it look like to run a role-playing game session without the use of a game master or a dungeon master that has to plan everything for you and work on everything and not be able to be a player? I think there's some games out there like I think Ironsworn is one of them that inspired me to start thinking about how to do a similar type of GM-less play for Entromancy. And that made me think more globally about game design and how game sessions work and how adventures work. And so I think some of this might be just interested for you if you're designing your own games, but also if you want to use this for your own role-playing games, I highly recommend it. I should mention that this module, Struct, is 99 cents to download off of DriveThruRPG, or you can get it as part of the entire Orchite Age Omnibus, which is available in digital and paperback format. You can go to nightpathpub.com to learn more. And so so we designed Entromancy, the role-playing game, with ease of use and low barrier of entry in mind. It's based on the D20 system, the open game license, but we've simplified and streamlined so many things to just make it easier to get in, play, have a great time, and not have to worry about things like itemization, management of like these granular systems. Just get in there, have fun, and do as little bookkeeping as possible. And of course, it's cyberpunk and it's fantasy, so it incorporates like cybernetics and magic and spells and all this cool stuff. But then we to figure out how to do a GM-less version of the game, because the game presumes that you have a typical role-playing group where there's a bunch of players, or at least one player and one GM or dungeon master. So how do you do that without the use of a dungeon master, so that like you and your friend can just play together, or you could play by yourself? So we have to think about, well, what does the general flow of a role-playing session look like? And what we came up with is this tool called Struct, which is it happens to be the programming language in the Entromancy universe. Essentially, I'm going to just read off here. Your characters can run simulations of missions and encounters over the network with extremely realistic accuracy through a combination of virtual and augmented reality. To simulate a mission, you'll begin by creating a struct, which is a collection of interfaces that will determine the nature of the mission's encounters and their outcomes. These interfaces include options like the global and faction objectives for the mission, the locations where the mission will take place, the nature of the encounters you'll face throughout the mission, and so on. Using an interface to determine an outcome is called implementing the interface. When you implement an interface, consult the table associated with that interface and roll the indicated dice to determine what happens. So there's some like in-world game speak here that we obviously, it's themed around our Entromancy universe, and the module to Struct definitely presumes that you have a copy of the core RPG book, the Entromancy, a cyberpunk fantasy RPG core rulebook, because you'll be referring to the monsters and the classes and the NPCs and the skill types and etc. So you'll need to have at least one of those on hand. There's also a free to download entry point, which is like a what do we call it? Like an onboarding guide or a new player's guide that you can download from DriveThruRPG if you just want to check that out. And so let's look at the type of interfaces that essentially comprise the entirety of a game session. There's a global objective, which will determine the overall objective for your mission, as Entromancy is mission-based. There's a faction objective, as there are factions within Entromancy. Faction points that will determine the number of faction points rewarded if they're applicable. Locations in the game, like where you're going to go within the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a dystopian cyberpunk future. What type of encounters will occur within your mission. The difficulty of a skill check. The outcome, whether what happens when you have a positive or negative outcome from a skill check. What NPCs you might interact with. The disposition of the NPC towards you. Combat difficulty, and what adversaries you might encounter within a combat scenario. We have a helpful, let's see if I can zoom in on this. We have a helpful little diagram here of how the run of play will work. Whoops. So you'll start off choosing your global objective, implementing that interface, and then you'll then implement these other interfaces to figure out what location you go to, what your faction objectives might be, and also what faction points. And then you'll start rolling encounters. Where are you going to go? Who are you going to talk to? Maybe you run into an NPC. Maybe you have to do a skill check. Maybe you run into combat. And then each of those interfaces then require you to implement, like if you go to combat, you have to figure out what monsters you're going to fight. If you go to if you meet an NPC, what's the NPC's disposition towards you and your party? If you implement a skill difficulty interface, what's going to be the outcome if you succeed or fail? And so you can imagine that if you're just like, deciding like on a Saturday, we're going to play an Entromancy game. And even if one of you wants to play as a GM, you might say, I don't have anything prepared. Well, you can use Struct to do that for you. And yeah, that will help you to make it up as you go. If we take a look at, for example, some of the interfaces, the global objective, when you implement an interface, that means that you are going to consult the table and then roll however many dice is required based on that table. So you'll roll 1d12 on the global objective, and I haven't prepared anything for the game, and all of a sudden I roll a 7. Our objective is to geek them answer. Rumors abound of a mage that has been summoning ceridium twisted from the depth of the void. Unearth their operation and eliminate any threats. Cool. So now that I've done that, I'm going to implement the faction objective to determine what my faction objective is for my whatever faction I'm ascribed to based on the core rulebook. And once I do that, I'm going to roll a d20 and figure out what location we're going to go to, and I can consult the Entromancy core rulebook to learn more about that location. Then I'll start rolling encounters, and so I'll roll a d100 and determine what my first encounter is going to be, and it could be I have to do a healing check or a hacking check, or if I roll between an 86 and 100, I have to implement the combat difficulty interface, meaning that I've run into combat. And then there are rules for what happens if you lose a skill check, or if you succeed at a skill check. And similarly, if you meet one of the NPCs, which are all listed with descriptors in the core rulebook, you'll have to determine what their disposition is towards you. And the combat difficulty draws upon the rules within the adversaries or the monsters in the core rulebook to see what kinds of adversaries you might have, how many of them, how difficult the combat's going to be. And then you get to play that out. So I should mention also that modules 3 and 4, which is comprise a story arc called The Present Past, they implement the Struct system in telling the overall mission structure for The Present Past Part 1 and Part 2. So and there's also an example play here that describes in much more granular detail how to implement the Struct system. So I have been searching for a long time for an elegant system that allows you to do a whole role-playing game, you could do like an entire campaign without designating someone as a GM, or having the GM be able to just sit down, start rolling dice, and create something on the fly. Certainly with the original role-playing game, with Entromancy, a cyberpunk fantasy RPG, our goal was to get you up and playing within like 10 to 20 minutes. So you don't have to spend a lot of time learning how to play the game or creating character or whatever. You can just start playing, and then there's a lot of depth for you to learn over time and incorporate into your game with some modularity. So like if you never want to use cybernetics, you don't have to, but if you want to get really into it, we have so much more for you within the core rulebook as well as in our expansion content. Similarly, with GMing, we wanted to see how do we make GMing easier, and the process of just designing and offering a role-playing session. How can we make that easier on everybody? And this is what we came up with the Struct system. And this required us to take a 1,000-foot view of like what actually happens within a game session, within an adventure path, within a campaign, and within a combat. Like how do we resolve a skill difficulty or an NPC interaction when we don't have someone calling the shots in terms of a GM. So this is our take at it. I'd love to hear your feedback on it, and I'd love for you to try it and see if you can actually port it over, not only use it for Entromancy, but port over this idea into your own role-playing games with other systems. And so please do give it a shot. It's available on DriveThruRPG for 99 cents, or like I mentioned, you can get the Orchid Age Omnibus, which includes not only Struct, but 4 other expansion modules. That's $4.99 as a PDF on DriveThruRPG, or you can get it on Amazon and DriveThruRPG in softcover for $14.99. So check all this stuff out at nightpathpub.com. Let me know what you think, and I hope you enjoy it, and hope to see you soon.